in .NET Core, what is Singleton, what is Transient, and what is Scope? We'll see now. The difference between Scope, Singleton, Transient, what is that in .NET Core? We'll see now. So let's see one by one. So Singleton. So what is Singleton? So only one service instance was created throughout the lifetime. So in Singleton, what will happen? We are going to create one single instance throughout the application lifetime. Okay. So means no need of multiple instances. One single instance is enough throughout the application. This particular scenario, we can go for the Singleton pattern. And this Singleton can be, an object can be reused same instance in future. So in Singleton, the same object can be reused in future. That is called Singleton. Now, so only one instance throughout the application. This particular scenario, we can go for the Singleton, and the reused, we can able to reuse the same instance in future. We can reuse the same instance in future wherever the service is required. Since it's a Singleton, lifetime service creation, memory leaks in the services will be built up over the time. Also, it has memory efficient. So as they are created once and reused whenever we want, wherever you want. So this is Singleton. So how will add services dot add Singleton in program.cs? We are going to add this. We'll show the syntax later. Services dot add Singleton. So for example, I login service interface, login service object. So means Singleton, one instance for the entire application. What is Singleton scope? One instance for the entire application. So this is Singleton. So now, what is the advantage of Singleton? Okay. The Singleton controlled access, lazy initialization, global access point, reduced namespace pollution, easier to manage state. So we are going to explain in detail in upcoming sessions. So we'll see one example here. So how to create a Singleton? I'll create a Singleton class, and then I'll create one instance for it. I'm going to create a read-only object, log with new object. So with private constructor, we are going to initialize this code. So with logging mechanism, if it is checking for the log, double check. If null, the instance is null, then only we are going to create instance. Otherwise, we are going to return the same instance. So this is how Singleton will work. And how to use Singleton? Like in the Singleton, we'll create the instance like this. Now, Singleton service, for example, I have a request 1, request 2, request 3. So we are going to create a new instance of each object. Instead of that, we are going to carry a single instance. So new objects are created on each HTTP request. However, both customer 1 and customer 2 has two different instances. So for customer 1, we are going to create a single instance throughout the application. So what is scope? How it will work in this service? So we are going to, with every HTTP request, we'll get a new instance. The same instance will be provided for the entire scope of the request. For example, if we have a couple of parameters in the controller, both object contains the same instance across the request. This is better option when you want to maintain a state within a request. I will create, for example, like the services dot add scope. We'll see one example. I'll go to Visual Studio. I'm going to any existing API, or I can create a new without code. I'm going to create a new project here. Go to create new project. So here I'm going to create one web API .NET Core. application, ASP.NET Core Web API application. So I click on .NET Core Web API, ASP.NET Core Web API, double click. So here give, so we'll give the project name application. So services are .NET Core DI dependency injection with scope Singleton and Transient. We'll create the application now. Click next. So I'm going to select .NET 8 and I don't have any authentication. I don't need now. I click on create. So this is going to create a .NET 8 Web API core application. And here, so what I do, I'm going to create one class. Let me create one folder first. I'm going to create one folder, scope or DI dependency injection. So first, let me create a class here. So here I'll go with the first I'll go with the singleton. Singleton service. First tag singleton service. So I'm going to create one service. So this is my service. So why I'm going to create a singleton here? Singleton, a single instance created and shared across entire application. So why we need singleton? This is good service when we require it or when we want to maintain a global state. That particular scenario, we can go for this. So for example, I just create one public GUID ID get set. So here I can keep private. Set alone I'm making as a private. See now what will happen? Public. Let me create a constructor. How to create a constructor? Class name as same as class name. We'll create a constructor. ID equals to GUID.new GUID. So I have created a singleton class here. So now I'm going to, what I need to do? I have to register this in program.cs. Program.cs, I have to register this. How to register? Builder.services dot add singleton. So like this, we are going to register that service. So this is how we are going to register the service. So now I have registered the service. Now, how can I use this? For example, let me go to a controller, weather forecast controller. So in the weather forecast controller, so if you want, we can create a different controller also. If you get confused here, so let's create controller MVC MT. I'll create or API. Let's create API and YMS API controller MT. DI dependency injection controller like this. I'll create. So now I want to resolve the dependency. How? Public DI controller. I'll create a constructor, and as we know, private read only. Instead of this, what I'm going to do? I'm going to do this like this way. So next, inside the constructor, we'll pass the argument, and within the constructor, we are going to do the instance for it. This is dependency injection. So we have created the injection for it. So this is done. Now how you consume? Public string get do not call the renewal string. So let's return underscore if service dot id dot toString. I'm just converting into string. So now let me run this. It is going to display the GID which we have created. So there is a Swagger error. Forget about this. So this is how Singleton will. Now, what is scope? So like this, we will add scope. For example, you can create one more class like this with one more class scope service, and we'll be registering here. Instead of add Singleton, we'll be writing like add scope. It's not a good practice to keep everything. Just I'm creating for our understanding. So here scope scope. Okay, now so the scope service we can register here. So how you register? This way. So why the scope is required? So when there is within the within every HTTP request, we are going to create a new instance. This particular scenario, we can go for the scope, and the same instance provided for the entire request response. So now, so what are the advantages per request? So one HTTP request, single instance will be carried. So here also we have improved memory management, cross request data sharing can be avoided, consistency within a request we can maintain using scoped. Optimal for, so where we exactly use database context. Okay, to register the database context, we will be giving scope instance. Transient mainly for the services, because that we'll discuss later. Singleton for the entire application. For example, you want to keep a logger logging the any errors or global exceptions, whatever you want to log. So that particular scenario, we can go for the Singleton database context. For example, I want to add a connection string in the program.cs. This particular scenario, we can go for the scope service. And how you it will be same way. So what we have explained similarly, I request ID generator request ID. So we are going to generate the request ID equals to GID. Like that, we will be creating and registering the scope services dot add scope. Like this, you will be registering. So next, so how you'll use? So in the we are going to create a for example, request controller. We are going to create a private read-only interface. Similarly, how we have seen earlier. So in the constructor, we'll be passing the argument and we'll be doing this injection. And in one method, we are going to create that request ID. We'll be getting in the scope. So this is how scope will work. So this scope on each request, for example, on each HTTP request, we are going to create a new instance. And what is transient? This is each time, okay? Each time, new instance every time. It is going to create a new instance every time. So this particular scenario, we can go for the transient. Each object in the HTTP request, it is going to create a new instance. So when it is a good approach, when we are working with multi-threading approach, because both objects are independent of one another. In this particular scenario, we can go for the transient scope. The instance is created every time they will consume more memory when we use the transient, and resources can have the negative impact on the performance, obviously. So utilize for the lightweight services with little or no state. This particular scenario, transient is preferred. So services that add transient like this, we are going to create. So like scope. So, and for transient, I'll create one more class here itself instead of creating a different class, transient. So in program.cs, I am going to create this transient. So this is how we are going to create a add transient. Simple transient. This is new instance every time. Scope, new instance per request. One instance for the entire application. Like this, it will be worked. So now, what are the advantages? Fresh instance. When we require a fresh instance each time when we request this particular scenario, we can go for the transient. So it will reduce the statefulness, and for testing it is easy. Flexibility. So how it is flexibility? Because it's allow greater flexibility with the services that may have a different configuration or states based on the context request is changed. This particular scenario, this is flexible, and the simplicity, lightweight, simple services, straightforward. We can go and use the transient. And how example, for example, logger, as we discussed earlier, public interface iLogger, I have a log method in interface. That interface I have consumed in a class, and here I'm going to do something. So this is a logging whenever required. Configure services. I'll go and register the transient service. Services start at transient iLogger interface and the class, so that how it can be used. For example, home controller, private read only. In the constructor, I'll pass the argument dependency injection. I can, whenever I want to log. So for example, index method is invoked, logger.log, index action called, index action ended. Any exception I want to log. So any performance I want to check how much, what time it got entered, what time it got exist, in between, how much time it took to execute this particular resource. All those things we can calculate as part of this logger. So this is going to create on each request. For example, HTTP request, we have 10 objects. On each object, it is going to create a new instance. This is transient. So Singleton, we can be using for logging services or feature log, deployment or email services. Singleton will be preferred. Scope, better when you want to maintain a state within a request. So this particular scenario, we can go for the scope, for example, database and all, as we discussed. So transient, this is to a lightweight approach with little or no state is preferred to add the services, to register the services. Transient is preferred. So this is about the dependency injection in .NET Core, mainly transient, going to create a new instance every time. Scope, new instance per request. Singleton, one instance for the entire application.